Thank you very much. It's really a great honor and pleasure for me to be here with you today. I have been working rather closely with this wonderful energy and environmental partnership for Central America, really almost since the very beginning in 2004. It has been truly exciting to see I think, hundreds of projects that have been developed, the wonderful networking among all of you and all of the others that have attended the other fora, and also just to have the chance to meet so many of you and to see the enormous progress that is being made in this region. I particularly commend this very strong partnership between Europe and Central America. The leadership initially of Finland and then of Austria and the European Union, and really focusing very strongly on this region, I think is to be commended. And I do hope that this initiative over the last 10 years is able to be continued and to be built on in the years immediately ahead. I'm also very pleased to say that over the last couple of years, the Worldwatch Institute has had an opportunity to become much more deeply involved in this region, and now to be working on Central America specifically for the first time. As you probably know, we are an international institute, focused very strongly on global trends, and as appropriate, we've developed an expertise on particular regions and begun doing projects in various parts of the world, whether it be the United States or China or Europe, or now the Caribbean, which is a very active program for us. Later today, you are going to hear from Alexander Ox, the director of the Worldwatch Climate and Energy Program, and also Ana Maria Majano with the Inkai Business School, who will describe to you some of our preliminary findings in our sustainable energy roadmap for Central America that they've been working on with their teams so actively, particularly over the last year. My role today is really to start with a global perspective on trends that are underway and leave it to the rest of the speakers, including our Worldwatch team, to talk to you very specifically about some of the developments in this region and the paths forward. I think we're living in a time of really, in some ways, a great paradox when it comes to climate and energy change. On the one hand, we see really rapidly accelerating evidence of climate change and its very negative consequences around the world. I think the past year has been particularly dramatic with the ferocious storms that have certainly hit the Americas, but also the terrible droughts in places like Australia, the enormous floods that have occurred in other parts of the world. The evidence is mounting all the time that not only is climate change a future threat, which of course scientists have been telling us for the last couple of decades, but that it is a reality now, and unfortunately a rapidly accelerating reality, which is already exacting enormous costs around the globe. But of course, while the dollar costs may be felt mainly in the world's richest countries, the human cost is found in the world's poorest countries, and in fact in the poorest populations within those nations. Of course, the concentrations of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases have only continued to accelerate in the atmosphere in recent years, which means, in effect, that we are virtually guaranteed to have a number of additional decades of very rapid climate change. We are really past the point where we're going to be able to stop climate change entirely, certainly within the lifetimes of probably anyone else in this world. But the thing that I think we all have to be focused on is that while we may be already starting to exceed various ecological and indeed human limits, the problem is only going to grow much worse if we don't do something about it. And we are not only going to be causing enormous problems for ourselves and the next few generations, but potentially creating a problem which it could take our future descendants many, many hundreds of years, if not more than that, to reverse. This is a very complex climate system. It is capable of all kinds of feedback loops so that what we cause to happen could then be accelerated in effect by the natural world. So the urgency clearly of not only doing something about the carbon intensity of the world's economy, but doing it right away is clearly before us. Now, of course, it's very easy to be somewhat disappointed by the relative lack of progress we've seen in climate negotiations. These have not been accelerating at the pace that the climate itself has been accelerating. And particularly someone like me who has been following these climate negotiations and attending many of them over the last 2 decades, I must say that in some ways it's very discouraging to see how slowly our global society is coming to grips with this problem. The other side of this paradox, however, is that while these global negotiations may be stagnating, in fact, the global transition to a very different kind of energy economy, what I would call a sustainable or a low-carbon energy economy, has really been accelerating very, very greatly, certainly over the last decade. But I think it's fair to say that we've never seen before the rate of progress that we've seen just in the last 5 years. This is, I think, probably the most dynamic period in the world energy economy that we've seen for a century. And so I want to just give you a quick overview of that and then walk through some slides that will describe some of the specific developments and the underlying factors behind them. The first thing that we have as a reason for optimism is just enormous market growth. Many of the markets for technologies, such as some of the bioenergy technologies, wind, solar, some even of the early energy storage technologies, have now been growing at double-digit rates for well over a decade. And these energy sources are coming on stream very rapidly, and the technologies are also advancing, particularly as we see university programs, the young people that are enrolled in those programs, and of course the capital markets themselves really investing more heavily in these technologies for the first time. Those market growth rates and that technology change, of course, is being driven overall by policy change. And I think this is one of the good news that comes from the overall growing awareness of climate change, and indeed the many policies, hundreds of them, that are being developed at the national and even the state and local level. These are really starting to stimulate market growth in a whole range of sustainable energy technologies, whether efficiency or renewables. And then, really coupled with the market growth and encouraged by the policy change, the economics of energy have really changed very, very drastically over the last decade or so. Fossil fuel prices, of course, have gone up dramatically. 10 years ago, $30 a barrel was considered a relatively high price for oil. The world market price has been consistently above $100 a barrel for most of the last several years. That trend, coupled with very, very rapid declines, particularly accelerating in the last couple of years, means that many of the renewable energy technologies are beginning to cross various thresholds of economic competitiveness. Now, everyone, of course, always wants to ask the question, when will renewable energy be competitive with fossil fuels? That is far too simple a question to ask, let alone to answer. The fact is that there are many, many applications for particular uses of renewable energy in particular economic circumstances where fossil fuel prices are high or renewable resources are relatively available, where those lines have already been crossed. There are now, I believe, hundreds of billions of dollars worth of investment in new sustainable energy technologies that are economical based on the dramatic decline in cost just over the last few years, combined with the fact that we're in this high growth or high cost era of fossil energy use. Let me now turn to some of my slides here to illustrate more specifically some of these really transformative changes over the last few years. This shows the global energy situation in a different way from, I think, what most of us are used to seeing. This shows the annual growth rate of various energy sources over a 5-year period, so that it turns out that while fuels like oil and coal and natural gas dominate the world energy economy today, in terms of growth rates, the fastest growing energy sources, in fact, are bioenergy, wind power, and solar energy. Now, this data is only through 2009. If you look at what has happened over the last couple of years, it is clear that the solar trend has, if anything, accelerated. Solar photovoltaics are now, I think, the most dynamic part of the world energy economy. But we've seen, while a bit slower growth in wind power, still a very, very robust industry. Biofuels have slowed down a little bit, caused mainly by the fact that not only are energy prices high, but food prices, and as a result, the prices of the grains that go into the production of the fuel, particularly in the United States, have tended to slow the rate of growth. I think the other thing that's worth pointing out here, the other thing that is beginning to change, is that the growth of coal is basically tending to slow in almost everywhere except China. There are only a handful of countries that really have very dynamic growth in the use of coal, whereas the growth in the use of natural gas has begun to accelerate to the point where many, if not most, analysts expect it to be increasingly the more dominant of the fossil fuels, which is certainly a very good thing in terms of the much lower carbon intensity of natural gas, but also presents, of course, a challenge because of the many environmental concerns, including potential methane leakage that go along with the use of natural gas. This slide on the bottom curve shows renewable generation as a share of total global power generation, and you can see that the growth there has been significant, but it is still not certainly a dominant share of the total electricity. By the way, this is excluding large hydropower. But in terms of the growth rates, you can see that renewable energy is already becoming a very, very dominant part of the system. And in fact, one of the remarkable things that we've seen in the last few years is that both in Europe and in the United States, there has been, in some years, more renewable energy capacity added than all of the fossil fuels combined. It is really sort of a remarkable change in the energy markets of some of the industrial countries. This shows the growth in world wind energy capacity, of course, a very, very rapid, up to about 200 gigawatts by the end of 2010, closing in now on 300 gigawatts of wind power capacity alone. This has been helped along the way, of course, by very, very strong policies that have been in place, has caused the United States to be a very large market, along with China and along with Europe in the last few years. But in addition, it's interesting that as growth rates have slowed a little bit, the industry has been able to catch up. And in fact, the cost of wind power, which many of us think of as a relatively mature renewable energy technology, has actually continued to come down more dramatically than any time in the last 10 years, just in the last 3. Now this shows the growth of wind power capacity in the United States, China, and Germany, which really between them are dominant in the global wind energy market. I think one of the remarkable things that it's easy to miss here is just how large a share Germany has, given, of course, that it is a much, much smaller country than the United States, let alone China. But the other thing I think that is extremely notable here, and again, this is a trend that has actually accelerated in the last few years, is that China has become far and away now the dominant market for wind power over the last few years. Now also has the largest manufacturing of wind capacity in the world. And this in a country which, when the EEP partnership was started 10 years ago, really had barely any wind energy capacity or industry in place at all. This shows basically the same general trend with this very, very rapid growth in China. Again, I think one of the interesting things that is perhaps missed in terms of understanding what's happened in the United States in the last few years is as a result of some of the federal policy under President Obama, but also very strong state policies. Unlike the trend here in 2010, if you fast forwarded it up to 2013, it actually appears that for the first time in probably 7 or 8 years, the United States has actually added more wind capacity than China has. Solar photovoltaics, very similar trend, except a much more rapid growth rate. As I mentioned, solar electricity is really far and away the most dynamic of the world's energy sectors, bar nothing, more robust than any of the renewable sectors, but also much more robust than, for example, the natural gas industry, which is, I think, getting far more publicity and perhaps attention from policymakers in some countries in recent years. The latest count suggests that total world solar capacity is now approaching 100 gigawatts. Largest markets are in Europe, but again, growing very quickly in China and the United States, which have been putting these stronger policies in place in recent years. One of the things that sort of stands out in solar, though, and it really reflects a similar thing that went on about 10 years ago with wind power, is that Germany has really led the way. You know, a relatively small country, certainly in terms of the global economy, roughly 80 million people, far smaller economy, of course, than the United States or China. But Germany has really had some very, very strong policies in place, a willingness to provide more subsidies, to really open up the grid to renewable energy in a way that other countries have not, and has demonstrated that even with a relatively modest endowment of renewable resources, it's possible for a country to become a world leader. This shows this incredible dominance of Germany. Again, something that is anomalous. It's because of the much stronger policies, but it has really led the way. It is one of the primary reasons, you know, in addition to, of course, the fact that the technology has continued to advance, but the real market driver that has caused a 60 to 70% decline in solar costs over the last few years is this really extraordinary German market. Here you can see, and let us switch to beginning to understand some of the dynamic things that are now underway in the Americas. That if you look at total renewable electricity generation, which of course includes large hydropower, that Brazil is actually far ahead of any of these other industrialized countries in terms of share. The difference being, of course, that Brazil has been, at probably 90+% renewables in the electricity sector for several decades, whereas some of these other countries are beginning to come up very, very rapidly. And here you see this non-hydro generation as a share of total electricity. Again, this is comparing the United States with Portugal, which actually turns out to be at the top of the list, then Germany. And again, Brazil, if you take out large hydro, of course, is much lower down on this list. But then, of course, when you get to some other energy sectors, you find that particular countries have strongest policies, and they turn out to be leading in these sectors. So in terms of ethanol production, biofuels, from things like sugarcane and corn in the case of the United States, Brazil has been a consistent leader, and the United States, as a result of a strong policy push in the last few years, has become also a leader in this sector. Now, as I've described these patterns, over the last 10 years and these accelerated growth rates, it is, of course, noteworthy and I think something that really needs to be dramatically addressed, which is that the countries that have dominated the development of these new industries have tended to be in the industrial countries. Industrial countries which, in some ways, are the ones that really should be leading to low-carbon energy futures, in the sense that the industrial countries, of course, are responsible for most of the carbon dioxide that is in the atmosphere today. But if you ask the question going forward, which countries are the ones that are actually going to benefit the most economically from an energy transformation and a movement into the development of new kinds of energy sources and away from fossil fuels, I think that it is irrefutably the case that developing countries are really in the best position and indeed have the opportunity to be global leaders and to move forward with the development of their indigenous resources. Of course, one advantage of developing countries is that the energy systems are continuing to grow rapidly. So, in the case of Germany, for example, you can only have renewable energy growth if you're at the same time shutting down fossil capacity, which of course means that the costs are relatively high if you're turning off something that you've already invested in and in theory could last quite a few years longer. In developing countries, of course, most of the growth in the energy system is yet ahead. And so the economics of renewable energy, just based on that simple fact, are much stronger. In addition, though, and this is, I think, is something that really is worth focusing on in terms of where we stand today in 2013, and that is because there has been so much change in the world energy system, and the cost of these new technologies has fallen so dramatically in the last few years, that there is now an economic opportunity to move forward that really there wasn't even 3 or 4 years ago. If you're looking at data on the economics of renewable energy and look at something that is several years old, it is literally outdated data. And so now there is an opportunity to in effect benefit from the fact that these markets are becoming increasingly mature, the prices are falling, and this is really, I think, the moment to get in, to be active participants in the development of these technologies and markets before they get to a point where it's very difficult to catch up with the market leaders. I think that this is something that China, of course, has begun to understand. China being Still, of course, a developing country and a relatively poor country in many of its regions, but it has nonetheless moved forward, used its industrial and technical capacity, and indeed learned from the policy successes and failures of other countries to be a world leader. This slide highlights just the different availability of solar energy in different parts of the world. And of course, you can see on this picture of the world that countries in the global south, very much including Central America, have far greater resources than you find in most of the industrial world, particularly if you compare solar energy, as you can see, the bright yellows and reds in various parts of the developing world. Compare that with what exists in Europe today. So if you take a solar panel that is generating energy at a particular price and bring it to an equivalent place in the developing world, you can often cut the price just in half just by the fact that the resources are so much greater. And just to sort of give an indication of how much difference resource availability could potentially make is that you see here that the German renewable resource, the German solar resource, which is relatively poor compared to that within the United States. And yet the German market has grown much more rapidly in the last several years. Now, if you had policy equalization, that is, if the United States, let alone other areas of the Americas, including Central America, were to have the kinds of strong policies that already exist in Germany, you would find that the economics were much better, and in fact, solar energy could move into the energy system very, very rapidly. This compares the United States with various areas of Brazil. You can see that Brazil, which is very strong in bioenergy, increasingly strong in wind power, but is just beginning to develop solar energy, has a very, very strong resource, equivalent to some of the areas of the western United States, desert areas in the case of the United States where there's relatively little energy needs. But in the case of Brazil, many of these resources are not only within reach of some of the major metropolitan and industrial centers of Brazil, but in fact could actually utilize the existing energy transmission lines that are used for hydropower in order to get that energy to market. This shows the Brazil wind energy resource at an elevation of 80 meters. Of course, in all regions, including Central America, wind is sort of a much more sporadic resource in terms of not being available everywhere. You have to find particular strong locations. But Brazil has discovered, as it's begun developing wind power quite actively in the last few years, that it has literally world-class resources. And one of the things that it has discovered as a result of that as it has begun to do a range of new all-source bidding, allowing different energy sources to apply to get power purchase contracts, that the auctions that have been held for wind power generation have actually produced lower estimated costs than have been projected by those that are developing the hydro and natural gas resources. This, I think, is sort of a prime example of the opportunity that really exists here in Central America. As these markets develop, as many of the particular areas that have strong renewable resources begin to be identified, and as the markets develop a rapid rate of market growth, I think you're going to find that, just as we're finding in many other particular regions of the world today, where you have relatively high fossil fuel prices and relatively relatively high fossil fuel prices and relatively strong renewable resources, that those price curves have in effect already been crossed. Now, that may not be apparent in the market today when you for example, install, one individual wind turbine or one small solar project, and you're importing all of the equipment and just doing one project at a time. You're going to find that the costs are rather high. But as you develop policies that really provide a stimulus to the market as a whole, provide investment certainty, provide an opportunity for developers of these new energy technologies to know that they're going to have a continuing flow of investment opportunities going forward, that will allow the development of a local infrastructure, local manufacturing, and installation base, and allow a variety of indigenous companies, perhaps in some cases working with international companies as well, to take these very strong global economics and translate them into a reality in the energy markets in Central America. So let me just conclude by congratulating all of you for the enormous progress that together with the Energy and Environmental Partnership you've been able to make in Central America over the last 10 years. I think you have in effect been climbing up a long hill and are really very near the summit now, where things get easier, where you can really push forward. I think that the opportunities for economic development, for developing a low-carbon energy future in this region are incredibly bright. I think you will see a lot of that in the presentation that my colleague Alexander Ox will provide a little bit later this afternoon. And indeed, we look forward very much to working with all of you in the years ahead. Thank you very much.